Starting in 3, 2, 1. The status quo is not perfect, but it does not justify you as an education system to ultimately expel these individuals. You're still in education institutions that still need to teach them about morality and still need to teach them about morals and still need to guide them at the end of the day. That is why we oppose Prana. That is why we oppose, and proposition is something that is very cruel. 2 points of rebuttals before moving on to our cases then. Firstly, let's engage on the argument about that there's no measurable threat towards these individuals who have been bullied, who are violent, and etc. Two responses, panels. We feel like the status quo itself is very much progressive. I feel like there's already a measurable threat within the status quo that is able to prevent these individuals from doing the certain acts in the very first place, but also give a deterrence effect within individuals who have already done it. For example, in Indonesia, we have peminaan or detention, for example, or anti-bullying and etc. Who are then is ultimately going to be very proportionate within individuals. Realize that something like peminaan and detention is something that is very tiring and exhausting within individuals, which creates that deterrence effect and also creates this kind of prevention method where it internalizes within individuals that they do not want to sweep the floors, for example. They do not want to stay an hour after school and etc. This prevention method is ultimately works, and I feel like this also rebuts their comments about victims. I feel like the status quo itself is already so progressive, where we also have we also have programs to recover the victims within society, within this bullies or violence system. For example, anti-bullying committees or counselors seeing their progress or seeing their mental well-being. That is very progressive. But then B, even if, for example, they do not have this kind of measurable threat, it is very much unjust for you to alienate these individuals and ultimately expel them. It is your duty as an individual. It is your duty, yes, to make up a safe environment for other individuals, but it is also your duty to have individuals to also progress, to also become a moral being, for example, to also guide them and to not expel them to no regulations and no supervision whatsoever. But then second rebuttal then, under the idea about accountability starts at home. Accountability starts at home. Two responses. We said that A, we agree that home is something that is very important, upbringing is something that is very important, but it still does not justify you the right of education, to take away the right of education with individuals. You still are an institution, you have to give them those kind of guidance at the end of the day. But then B, to some extent, accountability that's starts at home is ultimately not going to be that good under such proposition, where the environment that they grow up in within these violent individuals would ultimately not be that good, for example, where the reason why they become violent in the very first place is because of the environment. What are you supposed to do with those individuals? That is very harmful towards these individuals at the end of the day. But then before moving on to our cases panels, what do we want under side proposition? I just want to note that we do not justify violence whatsoever, but realize we want to see violent individuals who have those kind of factors that becomes violence in the very first place, which I'll explain later in my argument. But then the mechanism under side opposition is that most likely these individuals who have this violent upbringing would ultimately we were able to prevent it with counseling, for example, counseling or socializations, being violent or being a bully is something that is very bad. Regulations we're going to make it tighter, or the committee within status quo, or detention that I have already talked about. Then moving on, two arguments coming from side opposition. First argument then, under the idea about this is the responsibility to not abandon individuals. First layer then, under justification. Let me contextualize this argument then. What is exactly the responsibility of an education system, education institutions? Schools and education institutions have been given the trust by society and the government itself to guide individuals, to make sure that these individuals become a moral being that knows the moral being, that are able to teach these individuals, for example, moral judgment, to actually differentiate what is morally harmful or morally good within society or within themselves, for example, and etc. Or making sure that they are able to learn from their mistakes, for example, how they're so that they are able to become a productive member of society, that they are able to cooperate and they are able to distinguish what is the responsibilities as for me as an individual, students itself, and these bullies at the end of the day. And at the end of the day, realize that these individuals do not have any moral grasp whatsoever. Where they still do not have a moral compass to follow. Where the factors of being a bully is something that is very structural and something that is very, very wide within this debate. For example, the reason as to why individuals become bullies or violent in the very first place is because I already told you they have no moral judgment whatsoever. Or like secondly, the factors of environment. They grow up in an environment that with their peers, for example, that think bullying is cool. Therefore, they want to follow it, for example, because they want to fit in with the cool kids, or they grow up in a very harmful environment, and etc. And they have no regulations at the end of the day. I feel like this is very important for schools to like guide these individuals, because most likely this is the place where individuals would ultimately grow up in, right? Most of the time, individuals are at schools at the end of the day. They grow up within the environment of schools, where they see every day-to-day norms, for example. They see every day-to-day interactions, and they're able to internalize it, and they're able to also follow it at the end of the day. But I feel this is also important for schools to actually do this, not only parents, because it is the most accessible form of regulations happening to them. For example, formal supervision that is coming from teachers and etc., or like formal counseling that is free and is very much accessible towards these individuals, or like a support system that tells these individuals that no matter how hard life is, that no matter like what, if you're advised someone that is violent, this education institutions still wants you to go on and move on, to go on with your life, right? But then second layer, then why is expelling these individuals harmful? We say it is harmful because it takes away the basic rights of education. I've already told you. And side propositions want to argue that these are people, the minorities, and they want to create a safe space, which we say is something that is very cruel panels. Because I would argue these individuals are still vulnerable people that still need guidance at the end of the day, that do not need expulsions. Yes, we want to create a safe space, but it should not cost something that is very important, like education within individuals. That is something that you cannot tuck away. But then second argument coming from side opposition, then how it is counterproductive in solving the bullying problem. First layer, then how does this actually happen, panels? I feel like this argument would ultimately talk about how these education institutions are not able to solve the root problem within the reason as to why individuals are like being violent at the end of the day. But ultimately, it will ultimately shift the responsibilities and giving it to another school, and giving it to another school in hopes that they are able to regulate it at the end of the day. Realize that this is very much counterproductive, because the likelihood of them being like having this kind of deterrence effect is very, very unlikely, panels, because they don't see it as an opportunity to repent towards their like mistakes, for example. But because they have no education and guidance whatsoever, because they do not realize that this is something that is morally harmful towards other people, not only towards themselves. They only see that their actions have consequences, which does not inherently mean that they are able to repent. But then second layer, then why is this very much harmful towards these individuals? I feel like it harms because it's unfair towards these individuals, right? Where they have to face a lot of hurdles. For example, being denied the rights to education. I have already talked about this. Or but for example, again, like education disruption. It is likely for them to like moving towards a different school. It is likely for them to move to a different environment, for example, or like adapting within that environment, or like social stigma coming from their peers, for example, and etc. We say that this is something that is very much unfair and very much unproportionate within individuals. Under all those reasons, so proud to propose.